Well, good morning. Thank you for your interest in the Chicago Cenacle's first foray into digital ministry, this Coffee with the Conference Center series. Today's inaugural presentation, or first sip, is entitled Simon Becomes Peter, a Scriptural Story. It is created and facilitated by the canny and knowledgeable Mercy Sister Joy Clough and moderated by myself, Mark Piper, Director of the Chicago Cenacle Retreat and Conference Center. So first and foremost, welcome. Before I quickly go over the format for our hour together, a reminder and a request. A reminder that creating this digital ministry was a result of the Conference Center suspending operations, closing to the public on March 13th due to the coronavirus pandemic. We, of course, hope to reopen and resume our ministry of welcome and retreat when elected and health officials indicate that doing so is safe for everyone. As such, a request that we take a moment of silence to lift up and remember all those affected by the pandemic, for the healthy yet inconvenienced, to those sick, and those whom have died. Thank you. Now, before I turn this over to Sister Joy, please know that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Cenacle's YouTube page at a later date. Additionally, everyone except for Sister Joy and myself is now muted. Sister Joy will guide us through this story up until she leaves us with some quiet time and questions to ponder. At that point, we will unmute and engage in a conversation before we wrap this up. When we get to the conversation, if you would like to share something, please begin by stating your name and location so that we may have some level of community within this distant technology. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sister Joy.
So good morning and thank you, Mark. I'm really pleased to be gathered with you here via technology in an era when togetherness seems to mean technology. And just as Mark said, this webinar is a new venture for the Fullerton Cenacle. It's a new venture for me as well. So I hope it'll go well, but one way or another, we're all going to learn something, and who knows, we may have some great stories to tell afterwards. And stories, of course, is the key word for this webinar. So I want to tell you a story, obviously, from what you read about today's session, a story about St. Peter. But let me pause here and introduce St. Peter. Mark, I think you have a slide.
I do, right here, if it would like to work.
So that, in summary, is Peter, though perhaps you'd add another description or other ones as you recall stories of his discipleship. So back to me, Mark. But before we get into Peter, let's I'd like to invite you to reflect a bit on our stories. So Peter, Mark, can you bring me back on the screen?
I'm trying, I lost you.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Oh,
These are the learnings.
Yeah, this is the first one. Exit share screen. There we go.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, it's maybe not that important to see me. It's important to hear me. So I'll keep that in mind. So before we get into Peter, I'd like to invite us to just reflect a little bit on stories and our experiences of them, which means, of course, I need to begin with those 4 fabled words. Once upon a time, long, long ago, like when we were children, we heard our first stories, and most of us loved them, wanted to hear the familiar ones again and again, wanted to hear new ones. No doubt you can remember some favorite stories from your own youth. Perhaps some titles or story illustrations come to mind, because stories capture attention. If you've read to your children or your grandchildren, you know that firsthand. Stories make memories. They draw readers in. They're creative and fun. Stories can instruct, and certainly they entertain. Jesus knew all of that. Clearly, he loved stories. He taught by spinning stories. Once upon a time, there was a man who purchased a vineyard and let it to tenants. Or he answered questions by telling a story. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus said, once a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho fell in among robbers. He invited discussion by offering a story. What is your opinion? Jesus asked the Pharisees. A man had 2 sons. And so it went. Jesus' stories were good enough, engaging enough, that we're still hearing them, still telling them, still probing them. And yet, at this point, some of his stories, I think, at least for me, have become so familiar that they hardly entertain or instruct or provoke. We hear the start of a story and we think, oh yeah, this is the one about, or this is the time when, and our minds drift off. We lose both the story and the meaning. Now, imagination can be an effective antidote to such drifting because imagination focuses one's attention. Think of Bible stories that held your attention when you were a child. Well, stories and imagination are not just for children, and they certainly don't have to be childish. Imagination is central to the life of faith, says Pastor David Lowes, and imagination is a crucial means by which God's presence is mediated to us. And most of us have heard St. Ignatius Loyola's suggestion for prayer. Place yourself in one of Jesus' stories, he advised. Imagine yourself as one of the characters. Be a bystander, observing all that's happening. That, in essence, is what I do. And sometimes, when I allow my imagination to rove through the text, stories emerge. So you can imagine my delight when I came across this statement from a biblical scholar about imagination being theologizing in story form, not just storytelling, but a disciplined act of imagination that seeks to be faithful to the gospel text while drawing on the larger perspectives in the gospel's tradition, human experience. Now, I call the stories that I write my stories, but in truth, they are a gift to me. And they are, I believe, a gift of the Holy Spirit given to me to share with others. And I came to that belief because when I started sharing some of my stories, others appreciated them or found value in them. The stories seemed to enliven or put fresh meaning into gospel scenes that had become, oh, so familiar, perhaps too familiar. In addition to refreshing familiar gospel scenes, my stories share an underlying theme. Jesus is human like us. And further, all the people of the New Testament are human like us. I think that we often resist or overlook that concept. How often do you think of Jesus negotiating with a customer for some carpentry work? Or how often do you think of Mary trudging to the well each day, day after day, for the family's water? Human, like us, able to relate to our experiences, hopes, worries. Conscious or mindful of the true humanity of these biblical persons, we can turn to them with whatever is plaguing or delighting us, and such conversations with Jesus or Mary or Peter, simple, honest, intimate conversations, is what we call prayer. So back to Peter. He is so present to us in these weeks after Easter, but for the most part, it's a post-Pentecostal Peter that we see, strong, confident, preaching to multitudes in Jerusalem, healing a cripple, teaching through letters written to believers in later years. The post-Easter Peter is far less confident or committed. He doesn't believe the women's report about seeing Jesus alive. He runs to the tomb, but doesn't understand its emptiness. He's at a loss about the future, so he returns to what he knows best, fishing. And that's where we find him in today's story based on John's gospel. Fishing, fishing with friends, surprised by Jesus for breakfast at the lakeshore, trying to find his way back from the denials of Holy Thursday and the abandonment of Good Friday. I invite you to enter this story, which is part of Peter's post-Easter story, imaginatively. Picture the scene, hear the dialogue, smile, or shake your head, or roll your eyes. Sense the variety of emotions in Peter, but also perhaps in you. This story is entitled Peter, the Rock, but not always. Peter was strong, physically strong, strongly opinionated, strong in his enthusiasms. He knew this about himself and was glad, even proud of his strength. It was a key factor in his talent for leadership. Peter's strength had been unabashedly displayed this very morning when, without thinking about it much really, he'd hauled in the net of fish, single-handedly dragged ashore the catch of 153 large fish. Of course, the adrenaline of seeing the Lord had fueled that strength, but on reflection, Peter was pleased with his spontaneous display of prowess. Now, they were finishing breakfast on the shore. Jesus, so wonderfully alive even after he died, had served the group. James and John were there, Nathaniel, Thomas, Andrew. It was comfortable, brotherly, reminiscent of some special times they'd shared in the past. Peter was just finishing his third serving of fish when Jesus sat down next to him. Peter was touched that in front of these others, Jesus would choose to draw close to him. He knew he was forgiven for his treachery on that terrible night before Jesus was executed, but he still felt, shy might be the word for it, or awkward, or fragile. The feeling, whatever it might be called, was new to Peter and rather uncomfortable. Jesus positioned himself so that the two of them could easily look at each other, and then he spoke. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Jesus gestured toward the others, all of whom had looked up at Jesus' words. Simon, son of John. Peter was struck by the formality of that greeting. Some time back, Jesus had renamed him Peter, so why this return to Simon? And why invoke the heritage, his father's name? Hadn't he left home and father to follow Jesus? To Jesus' question, do you love me more than these? A strong and heartfelt yes rose in Peter's heart, but before he could give it voice, something else rose. The memory of that night. Did he love Jesus? Yes, surely. More than these? How could he claim that? Indeed, as they'd all confessed to one another, these, all of them, had run away, left the Lord alone to face his accusers and the angry mob. But he, Peter, hadn't just run. He'd openly sworn he didn't even know Jesus. Peter's eager yes stuck in his throat. And yet, with his eyes on the ground, Peter answered quietly, speaking for himself, not presuming to know the others' feelings or how they stood in Jesus' estimation. Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs, came Jesus' reply. Peter remembered those amazing times when Jesus had fed huge crowds with a few fish and a bit of bread. He recalled the bread and wine of their supper in the upper room. He smiled over the bread and fish he'd just eaten. Somehow, it seemed, Jesus was telling him that he needed to feed others. Peter wasn't sure just what he was supposed to do or when or how, but he knew that whatever it was, he would try mightily, strongly to follow Jesus' command. The rising buzz of conversation in the group stopped suddenly as Jesus spoke once again. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was confused. Didn't Jesus believe him? Was Jesus calling him Simon because he wasn't worthy of the name that Jesus had lovingly given him as a disciple? Oh, please, God, Peter thought, not again. Was he once again professing something he would betray? Peter felt his sense of strength drain away. With a sick feeling in his stomach and pleading eyes now fixed on Jesus, he responded with a voice that hinted at both fear and hope. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus did know that, didn't he? Peter wasn't sure he could trust his own words. So when Jesus laid a gentle hand on his arm, Peter felt a shiver of hope. Tend my sheep, Jesus said. Peter jumped to his feet. Jesus was giving him a task, but wait, there weren't any sheep here at the seashore. He sat down again, puzzled. He looked at Jesus and remembered the time Jesus had told him that he wanted Peter to strengthen the others in their company. Jesus had added something about Peter being tested and Jesus praying for him. Peter hadn't understood at the time. He felt strong enough for anything. But now he understood. And knowing how weak he could be, Peter received Jesus' words about tending the sheep or encouraging and strengthening others as a charge that depended mightily on Jesus. Jesus' prayers for him would be his strength. Of himself, he hadn't proved to be the strong character he'd always considered himself to be. Jesus was teaching him yet again. His shame, forgiven by Jesus, needed to become humility, a kind of unwavering honesty with himself that might enable him to tend others as Jesus had tended and was still tending him. Quietly, Peter placed his hand over Jesus' hand on his arm. It was a quiet acceptance, an act of obedience, devoid of any posturing or bragging. Jesus stood, and the rest of them followed suit. They cleaned up the fragments of their breakfast and put out the fire. They walked down to the boat to sort the fish and clean the net. And there, Jesus asked them to pause for a moment. And he turned to Peter and he said so they all could hear, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" All eyes turned toward Peter, and Peter's eyes, large with alarm, were on Jesus. Had he looked around the group, Peter would have seen curiosity, concern, confusion in the eyes of his companions. Why was Jesus repeating his question yet again? Was he testing Peter or teasing him? Was he trying to teach them all something? And if so, what might it be? No one spoke. Everyone waited on Peter. But Peter was shaken and silent. Why? Why would Jesus ask him this again? Heartsick, Peter questioned himself, doubted himself. He did really love Jesus, didn't he? He'd thought so before, protested loudly and confidently that he would go to death with Jesus rather than abandon him. Jesus had known otherwise, had known everything, had warned Peter. But Peter hadn't listened, had not taken heed. The bitterness of his betrayal began to churn through Peter's whole being. 3 times, he'd publicly denied even knowing the man, strengthening his denial by appearing not even to know Jesus' name. But he did know Jesus' name, and he did love Jesus, and he knew deeply because of what had occurred between them when Jesus first came to him after being raised from the dead. Knew that Jesus loved him unwaveringly, despite all that had happened. So this threefold questioning in front of all the others, threefold questioning in front of all the others. Peter looked at Jesus and went down on his knees. He would speak his heart plainly before them all, as Thomas had done recently. He would speak and then leave everything to Jesus. Peter opened his arms to this man who was so much more than man. "Lord," he said firmly, trustingly, "you know everything. You know that I love you." Peter felt Jesus' hands on his head in a gesture of blessing. "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. And then, as at the meal before his betrayal, Jesus again warned Peter about the future. "When you were younger, Peter, you went where you wanted. But in days to come, another will bind your outstretched hands and take you where you do not want to go." There, Jesus paused and drew Peter to his feet. He looked at Peter intently and said, "Follow me." Peter's heart sang. Yes, he'd heard what Jesus said. He believed and accepted this foretelling. His life was not going to be his own, and there was suffering in his future. But Jesus had repeated those first powerful words that had drawn Peter into discipleship. "Follow me." Such wonderful, welcome words. Simple, strong words from Jesus that were met in Peter by a single, strong sentiment: gratitude. So I'm going to invite us all to just pause for a few minutes over whatever in the story may have struck you. This picture of Jesus and Peter at the shore of the Sea of Galilee is actually from the shore of the Sea of Galilee. An alternate title for this story when I was writing it was Strong Before, Strong After. So you might want to think a little about how Peter's understanding of strength may have changed in this story, and how that may or may not be relevant to your own life. So, as Mark mentioned at the beginning, I'd like to invite us into some conversation about Peter, the rock, but not always. So Mark will unmute you all, and I think he asked if when you have a comment to make, you would introduce yourself. And just because I think we can all see, well, most of us can see one another. There are a few people who are on by phone apparently and can't see us. For the most part, if you want to say something, maybe you just wave a little bit and then the other people will know, and we won't have people coming in on top of one another necessarily. So let's talk a little bit about what the story may have offered to you. I mean, we probably have different answers to that question. It'd be interesting to hear some of that variety. So anything that you'd like to share, say, ask, contribute. Susan, Susan Tull.
I was impressed by how strong Peter was in faith. And before that, I thought he was just kind of a brute. He wasn't very deep, you know. And this story brings out he had grown so spiritually, his strength and his spirituality.
Marianne, did I see your hand go up? I thought so. Go ahead.
I think the reason Peter denied Christ was because it was out of fear. I mean, and we do a lot of things out of fear sometimes. And then when he had a chance to reflect and listen and, you know, realize the situation, then he changed his opinion.
Yeah. Yes,
Betsy Spearman.
Betsy, right.
It really struck me when you talked about the third time that Jesus asked Peter, and that Peter then at that point started feeling the shame all over again. And I thought about just in myself that I do things and I feel shame, and then I think it's gone, you know, I've recovered, and then something happens and it brings it up again. But the thing that really struck me there was that Peter knew that Jesus loved him, and how in times like that, that recollection, awareness that I am loved, it's just so powerful. And this whole thing where Peter then, again, I think it was a realization, and this is the way I took it, that the strength that he was so proud of was all well and good, but that the strength that he needed would have to come from Jesus.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Donna.
I've been to that place in Galilee in the Holy Land, the Church of Primacy. And when I was there a couple of years ago, I had been thinking obviously about this story, but also what preceded it. And I saw Peter there because I live on the ocean, saying to everybody else, I'm going fishing. You know, I want to go fishing. And I always saw that as something he wanted to go off by himself.
Oh,
Whether it was to contemplate or just leave me alone, people, I'm going fishing. And of course, they all stood up and said, oh, we'll go with you. We'll go with you. And I, you know, and then of course everything. And so I often saw Jesus's invitation, not only to love Jesus, but to bring Peter back into community.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt that when he denied him, he had in himself broke that brotherhood, that community with other believers. And I just saw the feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my lambs, as bringing him not just back to Christ, but back into community. And that's always been kind of special to me. Because I really thought he just, you know, I mean, around here I see a lot of men who, you know, when things get rough, I'm going fishing. And they don't want company.
Nice insight. Thank you. Oh. So let me ask you this. What does this whole story about Peter, what might it mean for us in terms of being strong disciples or followers of Jesus? What is the strength of a Christian believer? Or how are we strong? Doris?
Dory from Schaumburg.
Dory.
I think partly during this time especially, it's like everything's totally different. People are afraid, apprehensive and everything. And I just keep thinking that it's going to work out no matter which way it goes, that we're kind of out of control. We're not in control of it, God is. And you just have to have that kind of faith.
Peter's thought about he would speak for himself as honestly as he could and trust Jesus for the rest is, I think, sometimes where we are or would like to be, you know, to just share with the Lord in our own hearts and conversation, imaginative or mental conversation, you know, where we are and how we don't understand or are having difficulty accepting or totally wish it was otherwise or whatever, you know, and then try to trust that line from Scripture about God, all things, with God, all things work together unto good, something of that nature, which is, I think, really hard to accept. So the last line of the opening slide, that was a little characterization about Peter, you know, and the last line of that slide said, Peter, source of hope for us all. How do you take that line?
There's always a way back through Christ.
Think about the fact that Peter became the leader of the church. And yet we know all these things about him. what you expect of a pope.
Right. Even though he denied Jesus 3 times, he still became the leader.
Yeah. I mean, the one of the first interviews with Pope Francis, you know, tell me who you are, I'm a sinner. Whoa, that rocked most of us. That'd be the first thing I'd say about myself, I'm afraid, no matter how true it may be. And yet, sort of right in the tradition of Peter, you might say. There's a spiritual writer who has pointed out that for her, it's a great comfort that our first church leader has this whole story behind him, because it gives her hope that whatever we have behind us doesn't disbar us from membership in the community, as Donna was saying, or even from perhaps significant roles in the community. So let me offer you this observation as well. So this story is from John 21, if you want to go and check it out. But so Peter makes his profession of faith in Jesus, you know, 3 times, to community and to leadership in the community. And the very next thing Peter does is say, pointing to one of the other disciples, what about him? And Jesus has to say to him, don't worry about him. You follow me. And it strikes me as amusing in some ways, because Peter is rather impetuous, and you know, things have all become right now, and he's feeling good about Jesus. And the next thought that comes to him, well, so that's how my life is going to be. Well, what about him? And what about him? And what about him? You know, and he goes right back into that kind of impetuosity and blurting out whatever it is that, you know, that comes to mind for him, which in some ways is a real act of trust in Jesus, because Peter sometimes doesn't even see it till after it happens, but he feels totally free to be himself with Jesus.
Okay.
Even if he keeps, as it were, making the same mistake over and over again. And I think, at least for me, that's a source of hope. Because I've come to believe from my own experience more than anything else that we all have something, or maybe a couple things, that just plague us all our life. Something about which you make a resolution, you go forward for some period of time, keeping that resolution, and then sometimes knowing how or why, there you are again, right where you were before, with the thing that you were never going to do again, or never think again, or never, you know.
Yeah.
So Peter is an answer, an antidote, an example, a person who, as Jesus asked him to be, can strengthen those other followers, us other followers. So offer that to you for whatever it may be worth. So, any other comments, questions?
Well, I think it was a very thoughtful reflection and very descriptive, and beautiful the way you put that all together.
Thank you. As I say, that they're a gift to me, and I do enjoy sharing them with others. Anyone else? Okay, well, before I turn it over to Mark, I just would like to invite us to close with a prayer that hopefully reflects on some of what may have been meaningful for us in this story about Peter the rock, but not always. Right. Merciful and risen Jesus, By your forgiveness of his betrayal, you taught Peter that real strength lies in trusting you, in the humility of truth, and in a love that forgives. Help us to be strong and humble and trusting disciples. This day, we ask your merciful blessing on all who cry out to you for courage, health, trust, peace. We ask you to accompany all those the world over who are caught up in the pain, worry, and grief flowing from the pandemic, from food shortages, homelessness, loss of income, loneliness, or stress. Be with each person in need, and let each know your compassionate, saving love. Knowing that you are our strength, we ask this in trust. Amen. So, Peter, I give it back to you.
Well, I just have three quick things. The most important is a thank you to Sister Joy. She has given something similar to this in person, but just like the Cenacle here in Chicago,
Right.
all retreat centers are closed. So I was very pleased that she's helping us out by being this first inaugural webinar and converting what would be a very engaging in-person retreat to this digital format. So my deep gratitude and thanks to Sister Joy.
You're welcome.
Let me ruin gratitude by reminding you that the Cenacle is a Catholic entity, and it really wouldn't be a Catholic entity without an ask. And so while these webinars are indeed free, and I try to be as guilt-free as possible, if you did enjoy today and you're able, because I know what a economically stressful, beyond all the other stressors, time this is, you can hop on over to cenaclesisters.org/Chicago/donate if you are so inclined to do so, as we continue to do our best with our ministries, including, I'm happy to report that in compliance with the Illinois governor's amended stay-at-home order, we were able to, on a limited basis, reopen our prayer enrollment office on Monday. So phone and email orders are being taken, no walk-ins, everything is being sent out. We're not letting anyone into the building, but it is less than half its normal staff, quite literally the bare minimum. But for those of you who have en masse or prayer enrollments, the prayer enrollment office has been reopened. I haven't talked to Joan in about a day, but I know they were playing catch up. But I think if you wish to utilize them by Monday, they're probably back on track. So we're pleased with that. And then again, if you signed up for any of the two future events, next Thursday and the Thursday after, next Thursday with Sister of St. Joseph, Sister Rita Wilkie out of the Philly area. That is same time, or as they used to say, same bat time, same bat channel. That invitation will go out tomorrow. I see we got about a 50% of everyone who registered for today showed up, so that's not too bad. So there's probably room, if you still wanted to join next week, to still register, because again, that won't close until tomorrow. So before I drone on, I just want to say again, thank you to Sister Joy. Thank you to each of you who joined us in this endeavor, and perhaps we will see some of you next week.
Thank you for your attention and your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.